Okay, fantastic. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Clean Energy for Biden's second policy summit on equity. I am Nicole Steele. I will be your MC for the evening, and I am also a co-chair of Clean Energy for Biden. Thank you for joining us tonight for another evening of rich conversation, and a big thanks who joined us last week on the Summit for Infrastructure. If you have not already done so, please do register for our third and last night on innovation. That will be next Monday, November 30th at 7 p.m. Eastern. The registration link will be provided in the chat box by Marshall, who is graciously managing our Zoom room tonight. For those of you who are new to the efforts of Clean Energy for Biden, CE4B is a network of clean energy advocates that came together to elect Joe Biden, the 46th president of these United States. Back in April, CE4B brought together over 12,000 volunteers between now and April, raised over $3.2 million, and hosted over 100 grassroots events. While we reached our initial goal of getting Joe Biden elected, I want to be clear that our efforts will continue. As such, we are seeking feedback on future vision and goals. So Marshall will also provide that survey link in the chat as well. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge feedback that we received after the first event regarding diversity. First, I want to thank you for reaching out. It means a lot to us, and we really appreciate your honesty and transparency. Please know that you were heard, and we've been working to ensure that our next two events, including this one, and all CE4B events moving forward are more inclusive, especially tonight as we dive into our policy areas, specifically around equity. And before I hand over the mic, I need to give a huge thanks to Elliot Roseman, Barbara Tyran, Kevin Carroll, Marshall Duhl-Bakken, Charlie Piltzer, Jacob Ederer, Will Riker, and Alex McDonough for all helping spearhead the planning of these policy summits. So with that, I will hand it over to my fellow CE4B co-chair, Alex McDonough. So take it away, Alex.
Thanks, Nicole. As soon as we launched, Clean Energy for Biden members wanted to use their voice on clean energy policy, climate solutions, and environmental justice. So we organized the policy recommendation effort to capture our members' ideas and organize and curate them in a final guide that we have provided to the Biden transition team. 48 papers with over 175 recommendations are included on issues ranging from leveraging private capital and workforce development to climate justice and rural development. And I'm grateful to everyone who contributed so much time to make this effort a success. Each paper was drafted by a team of 3 or more volunteers, reviewed by an expert, and then fact-checked and edited by a copy editing team led by Alice MC Hammond and Francis Sawyer. A matrix tying each recommendation to the Biden climate plan was developed by Rekha Rao. And then Sam Pedretti, our resident graphics designer, compiled everything into a useful and beautiful document that's available on our website now. And none of it would have come together without our lead editors, Zoe Elizabeth and Will Riker. So thanks everyone for their commitment and work on this. It's important to note that while CE4B facilitated the development of the recommendations in the policy guide, to take a position on any of the recommendations. Each paper stands on its own and represents the views of its respective authors, and ideas and recommendations should be attributed to the appropriate author and not to CE4B. So now I'm going to quickly pivot to a fundraising pitch. Charlie, if you could put up the fundraising slide. On December 9th, CE4B is co-hosting a fundraiser for the Democratic candidates, Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff, for the Georgia special election. So please RSVP. These races can be won, and we'll decide the makeup of the Senate next year. And then second, the Biden-Harris transition team needs your financial support. Transitions are complicated in the best of times, and with the COVID crisis, it's even more urgent. So please learn more and consider donating. And if you have any questions, please email cleanenergyforbiden@gmail.com. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Tamara Tolzoloflin from 350. Tamara is an environmentalist focused on equity, energy access, and community. She develops capacity building programs and creates multimedia campaigns to dismantle privilege and increase opportunities for vulnerable populations to access healthy air, sustainable energy, and a toxic-free economy at the local, regional, and national level. Tamara, thank you very much for being here. Please take it away.
Thanks so much for having me. I just want to make sure, as a woman who wears many hats, I am not here on behalf of 350.org. If I were, it would be on behalf of 350 Action. But I'm actually just a human who wants a good person in the White House who reads and cares about climate and energy, which is actually a whole lot. So just wanted to put that out there as we get started. I'm super excited to be a part of the second round of conversation. It's my pleasure to be before each of you tonight as we go into the second round of spirited discussion and dialogue on recovery recommendations for the next administration. It's gonna be here, I can feel it, it's coming. Just wanted to say that it's particularly auspicious to be here to wade into discussion about equity as announcements about the appointment of an international climate envoy and forthcoming national envoy are made. Each will shape the outcomes of years of advocacy from our community and from the movement at large to limit the damage of the climate crisis for people and planet. So for my part of that, I'm excited to hold space for what will ensue, which is a discussion about jobs, infrastructure, and environmental health as the North Stars of equity and energy and climate. In this period of transition on transition on transition, it is significant that we rebuild together to address the harsh past, dig into the challenges of the present in order to sustain the promise of the future that we're all fighting for. So to set the table for tonight's discussion on ending our addiction to fossil fuels, climate justice, and lifting up all of the communities that have been made vulnerable, I'm gonna leave you with a couple of points from my own theory of action and really just the truth of why I get up every day to keep doing this work. Climate change is a design problem. It's a feature of independent systems that we built, operating to deliver us on schedule to a degraded planet full of exhausted people. Raise your hand if you're not exhausted. If so, please email me so I can figure out what you're doing. To change, we have to engage in a total redesign that includes new agreements generated by a practice of truth-telling, care, and repair. It's time for us to undo some stuff, and it feels like energy is as good a place to start as any. Equity itself is a practice that it requires the habitual refocusing of resources and norms to support the people, communities, and groups at risk of harm from a given action. And it really works when we intentionally shift the policies, practices, and activities we engage in to avoid those harms. That's just like the second reason why it's really important that we're all getting together for these kinds of conversations, because that intentional shift doesn't happen without intentionally different, unique perspectives and put into policy. The third thing I want to bring to you is that equity includes acknowledgement of past and ongoing injury, as well as consideration of the enabling conditions. This requires more than mere provisions of funding, training, retraining, and visibility, although we need to do those things as well. The fourth thing on my list is equity demands that the strategy for the next administration arrests our comfort in service of the broadest possible vision of success from the many in service of many more. The fifth and final thing I want to leave you with is that a lens on equity must be applied to the rebuilding of our nation to avoid false equivalencies in distribution, implementation of resources, and to uphold the most important credo that you will hear as a through line throughout what everyone here says tonight. That no community, no group or people should bear an outsized burden of environmental threats, ecological manipulation, or otherwise be excluded from decisions that determine their future for any reason, and certainly not for profit. As you're about to hear more about equity and how it shows up in real life, I hope that you will engage in this conversation fully as a participant and not as an other that thinks of equity as a nice to have. It's actually a must have in the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion framework. Diversity is the easy part. Equity is the thing that people lose their lives over. So super excited to hear the conversations and be a part of this community. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Tamara. Really appreciate your words and your leadership in this space. And we are ready to be participants as we are tonight. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Harold Mitchell Jr., who I'm happy to have him join us this evening because he joined us for one of our national phone banking efforts earlier in the year, and he is a former representative from South Carolina, but he also founded Regenesis Environmental Justice Partnership, which worked with local residents to identify quality of life priorities for redevelopment and attracted millions of dollars for revitalization in Spartansburg, South Carolina, which I think is a fascinating case study on, something that works really, really well. Harold was also Biden's Climate Engagement Advisory Council and really worked to mobilize voters during the campaign and the election. And we're really, really happy to have Harold back tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Harold.
Thank you, Nicole. And I want to first start by saying thank you to Clean Energy for Biden, because it was the effort of all the volunteers that made this possible to evict this man who's clinging on to trying to stay there in that White House, but he will be gone. But Sister Tamara, I just want to thank you for your leadership and everything you bring to the table and this conversation. And Nicole, it's with much, we've got a lot of work to do. Yes, we've been able to evict the man, but we have to look at what this big, bold plan for building back better in the United States is going to mean, especially, those vulnerable communities, Black and brown, white, tribal, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Island. I think the plan is very bold. And back in early July, when President-elect Biden said that he wanted to secure environmental justice and an equitable economic opportunity in a clean energy future, he meant just that. He sat down and he listened to leaders, frontline leaders across the country, to see exactly how to frame this plan. And coming out of that, he was able to, kind of parallel this with what we saw with the injustice, the racial injustice with George Floyd. It began to look at advancing racial equity across the country. And so these are things that in this conversation that we have here tonight, how do we move this conversation and engage those to take environmental justice, climate justice, and make this an equity conversation, equal access to all? This is what this man has stood on. And I think today, just by naming and being able to pull in John Kerry as an international climate envoy, that commitment has come before even naming members of the cabinet. Vice President, or as we can now say, President-elect Biden, that sounds so damn good. President-elect Biden is going to be able to move us forward. And I'm just excited to be able to hear this conversation, and without going into, it's kind of like, from a side where less talk, more action, hearing some of you experts tonight, this is what the people on the outside, what they're tired of seeing and hearing. I'd rather see a sermon than hear one. And a lot of what you've done, especially you, Tamara, is putting action boots on the ground, which is what we're going to need in Georgia. And thank you for sending those resources to Georgia, because we still need to be able to get those 2 Senate seats so that we can get the Senate to be able to fund this huge plan that we know the Republicans are going to push back on, just like they did in 2008. Make no mistake about it. We've got our work cut out for us, which is why we have to continue to fight if we're going to turn this corner and turn this Titanic to be able to implement this Build Back Better plan. So I just want to say thank you, Nicole, and thank you to this entire organization as far as volunteers that got us where we are right now, that can be able to take that North Star, Tamara, like you said, we got to take that North Star and implement this plan.
Thank you so much, Harold. We really appreciate your comments and always inspiring. And obviously we're very happy to be working on building back better. So with that, I'm going to very quickly say that we're going to dive into the panel discussions now. We will have 15 authors in 3 different panels. And I want to flag for anyone who's participating that we are taking questions in the Q&A box exclusively, but we're not going to be able to answer them during the presentation tonight. So what we'll be doing is collecting those questions. So please ensure that you include your name and your email address or whatever way you want to be contacted, smoke signals or whatever. We will make sure to get an answer back to you. So with that, and I'll remind folks as we move into each panel that we will be taking Q&A. Or I should say Q in the Q&A. And so I'm going to hand it over to our first moderator, Vienne Trong, and she's one of the country's leading experts and movement strategists on building an equitable green economy. She advises lawmakers, universities, foundations, and organizations on developing an inclusive workforce, creating sustainable economies, and equitable environmental policies. She directs the climate justice efforts for Tom Steyer PAC, and Vienne staffed and supported the Biden Climate Engagement Council to mobilize diverse voters. We're so incredibly excited to have Vienne with us tonight. So please take it away.
Thank you, Nicole. And just also thank you, Tamara and Representative Mitchell, for your, not only for your words, but for the work that you've been doing day in and day out for years and years and years. And that's why we are now seeing a new dawn, a new light that's coming around. And I'm so excited to be talking a little bit about how do we do that right and well with this amazing group of panelists today. So first up, we're going to have Greg Smiested, who's a physical chemist who helped review hundreds of Recovery Act grant applications for the U.S. Department of Energy. He's an active but emeritus editor for the journal Solar Energy Materials and Solar Cells, and he's the owner of Soul Ideas Technology Development. We also have Lori Wigand Jackson, who's a successful entrepreneur and an energy engineer. She's known for her accomplishments and her advocacy for gender equity and climate action. She's the founder and president of Utility Advantage, a certified woman-owned business enterprise that provides energy management and sustainability solutions. She's the chair for the board of council on women in energy and environmental leadership. We also have Christina Bowman, who is an amazing and awesome badass energy equity and climate professional. She previously worked on clean energy for low-income communities at the U.S. Department of Energy. She currently works on subnational and international climate policy and equity as a senior manager at the University of Maryland Center for Global Sustainability. We also have Alan Klaus Anderson. He's the vice chair of Pausonelli's National Energy Law Practice Group. He represents renewable energy developers and projects across the country. He's an adjunct professor of law at the University of Kansas School of Law, where he teaches renewable energy law, practice, and policy. And we have Brianne Eby, who's a transportation policy research professional. Her research interests include urban transportation policies, the nexus between human behaviors and policy, and facilitating shifts towards lower emissions nodes. And she's a bicycle commuter. So let's see a quick video of them kind of summarizing some of their policy papers and recommendations.
Greg Smiested here. In order to overcome barriers to building a clean energy workforce, 1, we need to create a national council on workforce development at the White House level and an energy workforce development office in the Department of Energy. 2, we need to utilize data, for instance, GIS and EPA's environmental justice screen, and information from other departments to do a whole of government approach to define clean energy regions and clusters to grow the appropriate industry. 3, we need to develop nationwide approach to green job training for people already in the workforce or expected to join the workforce in the next few years, targeting transitioning, low-income communities, and communities of color. Build an education system that links union careers of the future to today's students, especially students of color and women. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Lori Wigand Jackson, president of Utility Advantage and lead on this paper, working with an amazing team. In order to address the lack of diversity in employment and opportunities in the energy sector, we recommend leveraging federal buying power and funding with mandates to businesses, organizations, and public colleges and universities to improve diversity so that anyone receiving federal subsidies or grants must enhance and disclose diversity metrics, conduct anti-bias training, implement equity action plans, and implement a mandatory set-aside of 30% of that funding for women and BIPOC-owned businesses. We call for a ban on companies from requesting salary histories and legislation to expand paid family leave nationwide, subsidize family care networks for child care and elder care, and last, to ensure that the best and brightest have equal opportunities and the workforce looks like the communities they serve. We must build a talent pool, a talent pipeline, and develop and support qualified diverse workers and leaders through K-12 STEM programs, climate education, diverse workforce recruiting and training, funding for nonprofits that advance workforce diversity, events to keep diversity at the forefront of the clean energy economy, and expanded support for women and BIPOC-owned businesses to level the playing field.
Christina Bowman here on bringing jobs to underserved communities. My co-authors and I provide recommendations to support job creation, in particular for communities of color, low-income communities, and frontline communities. Through reauthorizing the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program, through increasing funding for the Weatherization Assistance Program, in addition, expanding other federally funded programs and partnerships to create opportunities for women, communities of color, low-income, and frontline communities, and scaling up nonprofit community job training programs, innovation, and entrepreneurship. This proposal would modify and expand existing programs and support additional efforts to ensuring equitable representation of underserved communities to build an inclusive and diverse clean energy workforce of the future. Thank you.
We're at a point where renewable energy generation is now more cost effective than continuing to operate existing fossil fuel generation in many cases. As such, fossil fuel power plants will continue to be closed and at an increasing rate. This is good for the overall economy and for the advancement of environmental interests, but it'll also disproportionately impact those certain communities and workers. Therefore, we must do something in those communities in order to save the social fabric. What we recommend is the Biden administration first socialize the fact that the economics of renewable energy will dictate this shift and be honest with people that this transition will impact certain communities of workers. There, they can now pursue legislation that would do things such as secure pension benefits, health benefits, and training for fossil fuel workers, as well as develop a strategy and an expert panel in order to find transition strategies that can help these communities.
Hi, I'm Brienne Eby. Our current transportation system exacerbates inequality, contributes to local air pollution, and is physically unsafe, especially in communities of color and low-income neighborhoods. To advance justice in transportation, my team and I recommend that the Biden-Harris administration invests in accessible, well-maintained transportation options by prioritizing underserved communities in a portion of U.S. DOT transportation funding programs, provides accessible options for unbanked households and those without internet access, addresses transportation's connection to housing by prioritizing affordable, transit-oriented housing, engages with representative community-based organizations when planning DOT initiatives, directs the Council on Environmental Quality to consider cumulative health impacts from transportation-based pollution, and uses financial incentives to make zero-emission vehicles more affordable. Thank you.
Awesome. We are packing a lot of information into this panel. And as Charlie is navigating the video, I want to queue up Christina Bowman as our first speaker. Christina, our country is now faced with so many businesses that are being affected by COVID. We're facing economic volatility, a real financial insecurity for so many families. We're talking here about creating jobs. You and your team wrote a paper on addressing these issues. Can you share a little bit about how you see bringing not only jobs and investments as well to underserved communities?
Yes, thanks, Leanne. It's an honor to have you moderating us, and thanks to CE4B as well. One of the goals of the Biden-Harris's $2 trillion climate plan is the creation of millions of new jobs and includes a 40% carve out of direct benefits to underserved communities.
Job creation in these communities and equitable representation in the clean energy workforce should be a priority and a central goal of this investment. So the Biden-Harris administration can meet its climate, jobs, equity commitment by increasing federal funding to programs that scale up energy efficiency. These efforts would spur economic development, entrepreneurship, and local job growth, and in addition, help address, for example, energy burden in low-income communities and communities of color. Many energy efficiency jobs are inherently local jobs that provide good wages in a multitude of sectors. And so the way that we bring these good paying jobs to low-income communities, communities of color, underserved communities, relies on workforce development policies, job training, implementing community workforce agreements. So, such that hiring a certain percentage of workers local to the communities being served, and thus ensuring that the benefits of energy efficiency investments and job creation accrue to underserved communities and workers.
Nice. I want to hear you say a little bit more about these federal programs, because you've been studying and doing the research on this a bit. How are the ways that we should expand which federal programs and partnerships in communities?
Yeah, thanks for that question. My co-authors and I focused on prioritizing the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program and the Weatherization Assistance Program. These are bipartisan programs, they're job creation programs that fundamentally serve low-income communities and underserved communities, but they're underfunded. So we propose reauthorizing the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program. This can be applied to retrofitting municipal buildings, schools, healthcare facilities in partnership with community organizations. And these types of projects have a huge job creation potential. And in reauthorizing this program and prioritizing projects in underserved communities, especially those hardest hit by COVID-19. Also, by significantly increasing funding for the Weatherization Assistance Program, or WAP, we can serve millions of low-income households that are in need, create more jobs through expanded weatherization services, and in doing so also enabling program coordination with the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. And this will help streamline the delivery of weatherization and solar projects and funding for state and local agencies. These two programs, for example, they're proven tools for economic recovery and job creation. We know this from the last recession, and they can be scaled up and paired with workforce development policies, job equity measures. And so the Biden-Harris administration could quickly address the economic downturn due to the COVID-19 crisis, and we can emerge with a more equitable, clean energy workforce that provides jobs to underserved communities.
Nice. Well, I want to thank you not only for this amazingly well-written paper, but also you talk about community partnerships. I know this is not just words for you. You've been doing the work, and I've seen how much you've thrown down for the campaign. And I just want to give you your public shout out, because you've been crushing it. And I just really have been appreciating just a partnership with you guys about doing this work. So thank you. And thank you for this paper. So now let's turn to Brianne. Brianne, we've been talking about climate change, and Christina touched on the clean energy jobs for low-income communities. You deal with transportation, which is incredibly significant and a priority these days. Tell us, what does transportation justice mean to you in the context of addressing broader societal and environmental problems?
Sure. So I think it's helpful to bear in mind the Environmental Protection Agency's definition of environmental justice, and a similar definition has also been adopted by the USDOT and the modal agencies. So EPA's definition is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. And I'll just give one example right now of how this plays out. So in the United States, Black and brown communities have historically been pushed to the geographic margins due to racial redlining and economic inequality. And this means that these communities must often live further from the job centers where they work, often requiring them to spend disproportionately on transportation in terms of time and money. And these communities are also disproportionately exposed to air pollution associated with automobiles. Providing access to cleaner mobility options and doing that in a way that involves underserved communities in the decision-making process, I would say is one way to, especially when it's coupled with housing investments. So for example, through the low income housing tax credits, to address historic inequities that have left these communities behind. Reducing transportation burdens not only helps these communities, but it helps the broader populace and the broader economy.
We have a little bit of time, and I don't want you to rush through the recommendations that you have worked so hard on. Can you tell us, when you think about the transportation needs and priorities that are spanning urban, rural, and suburban communities, what surfaces for you as one of the top things that we should be paying attention to?
So I think about infrastructure as job creation, really. That's an area of focus. And so investing in clean transportation infrastructure is a way to create jobs, and that job creation should be equitable. DOT infrastructure investments can emphasize maintaining existing transportation facilities, so roads, transit infrastructure, transit service, and that's a job creator. Maintaining what we have already built prevents the creation of new and sprawling and thus polluting infrastructure. However, new development as well, which also creates jobs, should prioritize access across all modes in communities that have historically been underserved. And this new development should incentivize making electric vehicles and their infrastructure more affordable. And I think this could happen via future COVID funding packages, which might prioritize maintaining our current infrastructure as well as protecting the workforce. And DOT formula funding is another area to invest in infrastructure and improve transportation equity by allocating funds to those who have been historically underserved.
Amazing. I mean, I would just want to reflect back what you heard, because I know this was an improv question thrown at you, but in that answer, you just threw out the way that we invest smartly in transportation can improve not only creating jobs, but the quality of life across the board. It improves the infrastructure and the ability for people to live safer and have better access to different resources in their communities, and creating a workforce pipeline. And you just threw that out on the top of your brain. So just kudos and thank you for being awesome. Let's bring in Alan. Alan, we're here talking about climate solutions and to build back better. You deal with something that requires us to not only think about building back a better future, but making sure we leave no community behind. Can you say a little bit about what the implications are that Christina and Brianne has talked about? What are the implications for pushing towards this clean energy future? And how can we make sure that these infrastructure investments happen in a way that is responsible given our current economic recession?
Right. So the good news of the story of the transition to renewable energy and a clean energy economy is that it economically makes sense. It is going to happen. If you look at the data and the study of the economics of renewable energy, it some time ago became the cheapest source of new energy. It has since crossed over to many different places and different comparisons that it was cheaper than currently operating fossil fuel generation. So because of that, and as we push further into this, we will have a transition to clean energy, and we're seeing that take place. The impact of that, so that's a good part of the story. What that means though is, while we can have an overall good for communities and for the country and beyond, we can have disparate impact directly to communities and to different kinds of workers. And so if we fail to take that into account, we can fail to plan for it and help those communities. And then what we've seen is when we have certain communities that are impacted, and they can be impacted pretty significantly. So if an area has high percentage of fossil fuel workers that aren't transitioned over, you can have obviously high unemployment, which leads to kind of further degradation of the social fabric, which then continues down a path that is bad for the overall community. Also, the communities themselves can have significant tax revenue and other revenues from these fossil fuel plants or other things. And if we don't prepare them for that transition, again, significant impact to communities, even when we have a greater overall good. So the good news story is that it's happening. Economics are going to dictate it. The story that we need to focus on then is also how to help these workers in these communities.
Well, let's go a little deeper. How do we do that? How does the Biden administration do that in ways that differ from what the last administration and the federal government has done so far?
Right, and this will be, as you can imagine, like many other topics, will be an amazing contrast. So, first, we look at what has taken place. Is there has been an ignoring of the problem when the president said in different communities, "Don't worry, all the coal jobs are coming back." That was a lie. Then we all knew it. As President-elect Biden did say in one of the debates, there will not be another coal plant built. There have been coal plants permitted, and there won't be a bank that will finance a coal plant. So there won't be new coal plants, and we know there will be an immense amount of coal and natural gas plants closed. So by telling people nothing to do here, everything's going to come back, and miraculously we'll have all the coal jobs, that wasn't going to happen, and it didn't happen. And so, the previous administration just did nothing. And so it lied to these people and left them down the cold. So now for the Biden administration, there's a number of things that have to take place. And so there's some near-term efforts that can be made related to, pension, healthcare, and then some federal, hopeful funding for communities for retraining of workers. Also, as we've done in different other industries, whether it be the lumber industry in the Pacific Northwest, it had a transition where it all left the Pacific Northwest and went to other regions of the country or beyond, or automobile industry, or all these different industries. We've had examples of transition of communities and workers. And so this is where, if you take the benefits of the federal government and bring in expertise and data-driven people that are willing to kind of put in the work, it can develop the best strategies and programs for these communities while we have some stopgap measures to hold things in the near term, longer term strategies that can be brought to bear to help the communities and the workers themselves.
Yeah, I think what struck me when you were saying is the distinction between the last administration. It was like a man was drowning and the last administration said, "Don't worry, stay still, rescue is coming," and then did nothing to rescue them. And now they're in even worse conditions. And the work now we have to do is make sure that the Biden and Harris administration really help invest in these communities and bring them forward, really throw in the lifeline.
Yeah, you're right. And they spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to prop up uneconomic coal plants. That message was sent to states. They made the same mistake. There's, Ohio did it, other states did it, where they tried to, in Indiana, on trying to hold back what is inevitable. That's just lost money that could have been put into the transition. So it's kind of a sad story when you have that kind of messaging from above.
Yeah, it's like a triple whammy almost, right?
Right.
Did nothing, made it worse, and then wasted our tax dollars.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to bring in Greg to this conversation. Greg, you're helping us kind of tie some of these conversations together. As you look across the various conversations we've had with the panelists, what do you see as the key distinctions and differences?
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I see both. I can focus a little bit on the unique characteristics. For instance, Christina, her presentation looked at the Conservation Block Grant Program. And the way I like to look at it, the handle that I use is looking at the number one, that, like she said, this was done during the Recovery Act. This is a known quantity. So one could look to see how successful it was, and one could look at the investment dollars per job created. And it's a metric that one could use both for private and for government systems. Then, of course, she said the Weatherization Assistance Program. And there she said in 2010 in the paper, yes, I've read all the papers, and I hope everyone also has the opportunity. They have the link. The references of all of these papers contain, another infinite amount of well-researched material. These things weren't pulled from the air. So she sourced that and said that in 2010, the WAP program, the Weatherization Assistance Program, weatherized 340,000 units, supporting 28,000 jobs and increased national economic output by 4 billion, because for every dollar invested by the government, the private sector steps up and invests as well. There's a leverage effect, a multiplier effect. And so that's this investment per jobs. And that's what one of the takeaways that I find from her work and her group's work is the use of the Conservation Block Grant Program and the Weatherization Assistance Program. Brianna mentioned a number of things, but when I dug a little bit further, I see that she's going to be recommending that the Department of Transportation support what's called Section 5310 for mobility for seniors and people with disabilities. Again, that was in 2019, but their group wants to expand it to Native and tribal and peoples of color as well. So again, building on success, we know what works, and then expanding it to other communities. Okay, and then the other interesting thing when you read their report is using the housing and urban development affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And so again, getting HUD and other departments working together. And that's what I keyed in on as well. You should as well look at what the other departments can do in the executive branch to work together. Okay, and Alan, when you look at what he presented, this is something unique about his. We hear about fracking, we hear about natural gas, we hear about coal. Well, their work uniquely suggests how to support that workforce and how to transition that workforce into the clean energy economy. And that sometimes goes without talking about. But if one looks at the scientific literature, there was one 2017 report, Heidi Garrett Peltier, now at Boston University. For every $1 million you invest in oil and gas, you get 2.2 jobs. For coal, 3.1. For mass transit, 8.93. Mass transit and rail. So there's another support for investing in transportation systems. Building retrofits, 7.7 jobs per million, and solar and the other renewables about 7.5. So I find that, again, we see that investing, transitioning people from fossil fuel industries is not just good for the planet, it's good for creating jobs, this investment opportunity per job created. And then, of course, we come to the one that I was representing, and we found that the unique thing about this is that it would be at the White House level to have a workforce development council at the White House level. And this is a way for all of the departments to come together, Department of Transportation, the EPA, the Department of Energy, which will have its own assembly of workforce development. And these can then, on a county level, determine where the opportunities are in terms of renewable energy resources, and also where then the opportunity is in terms of the people who are in need. Mm-hmm. So combining Department of Labor, Department of Interior. And then Lori, since my time is up, she's going to be talking.
Greg, she's going to go next. Why don't we hand Lori the mic, and she can help share a little bit about her recommendations.
I will do that. She should do that. Thank you very much then.
Thank you so much, Greg. Lori, incredible entrepreneur, engineer, and leader on gender and equity. As we talk a little bit about what we see as the future, what shines up, highlights, comes up for you as the similarities between all of the speakers and papers?
Well, you know, we are at a really unique time where significant investment is going to be made in the energy sector. Now, I've spent my entire career so far in an energy industry that has not been very effective in implementing strategies around diversity. And so this opportunity is one that we don't want to miss in terms of bringing women and minorities, people of color, indigenous people, Blacks into this opportunity for prosperity. So what I see is sort of the common thread is that we see this as an opportunity for providing good paying jobs in places where they just haven't had those opportunities. And so whether it's a geographic focus, looking in certain communities and helping to develop jobs there, or if it's just looking overall at utility companies, at clean energy companies, and looking at their workforce development, including professional positions, leadership positions, management, executive, board positions. There's tremendous opportunities that are going to develop from this. So I think that while we've been frustrated that diversity hasn't happened kind of in and of itself, because we know that it brings increased profitability, it brings innovation, it brings better workforce satisfaction. It's going to take specific initiatives, such as have been already described. And in our paper, we talked in our recommendations about data tracking, for example, mandating that any of the businesses that are taking advantage of incentives or funding from the federal government be required to track key metrics around diversity in their organizations, that they implement equity action plans. And then the tracking of data will actually show us, are these initiatives having the kind of impact that we are hoping that they will? So we're very focused on that. We've all on our papers talked about workforce training, and that's really important to be reaching out. We have to build a pipeline for these positions, and that pipeline starts with students with STEM education, and then it moves into the workforce for people transitioning out of whatever sector they're in into the energy sector. I advise everyone that I meet to come into the energy sector. It's been an amazing place for my career and for others. This is really, opportunities now with the kind of investment that's going to be made. In order to address global warming, we need to grow renewables at a rate that is 6 times faster than we're currently growing them. The idea of the number of jobs that get created with that, across the board, every level of job. And that's just one area of focus. You talked about transportation, other areas. The investment is going to be significant, and we want everyone to benefit. We want women and minorities. The other thing too is, as an entrepreneur, less than 3% of women-founded startups, less than 3% of the over $100 billion of venture capital that was invested in 2019 went to women-owned startups. That is just an unbelievable statistic, and we need to do better than that. So again, having mandatory requirements to support women and minority-owned businesses with some of this funding that's going to be provided is another way for us to really have a significant impact. And we know that minority and women-owned businesses hire minorities and women. So it's just a great way for us to try to increase diversity.
Totally agree. And I cannot agree with you more about the importance of investing in supporting women, people of color, businesses of color, and just your incredible business and your leadership is a prime example of when we do that right and well, what can happen. So thank you for your words, and thank you for everybody for the work that you guys have been doing to make this country better. It's remarkable. As Prince said, this is a fight for the future, and the future is worth us fighting for. So thank you for fighting with us for this better future. With that, let's hand it back to Nicole.
Thank you, Vian, and thank you, Christina and Brianne and Alan and Greg and Lori. Thanks for all of those comments. I do want to remind participants that are watching this evening that you can submit questions in the question box on your Zoom account, and we will be collecting those questions for later, and participants will be able to answer those questions following tonight's presentation. So please remember to leave your name and any contact information, however you would like to be contacted with your question. Otherwise, we won't be able to reach you. So next, I'm going to introduce Devin Hampton. Devin was an executive council member of CE4B, or still is, I should say, and he's also the chief executive officer at Utility API, whereas that's a software company that's building the foundation for a new energy economy by providing a fast and secure platform for exchanging energy data. He's also the founder of Empowering Diversity and Clean Tech Edict. It's a collective of over 40 companies committed to building stronger businesses through diversity. He has worked as a consultant for clean energy startups and investors, and was also appointed by the Obama White House as chief of staff at the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, as well as a series of leadership positions at the U.S. Department of Energy. Before his time in federal service, Devin worked in local politics in Washington State, and he is a graduate of the University of Washington and has been recognized by the Atlantic Council as an emerging leader in environment and energy policy. So with that, take it away, Devin.
Nicole, thanks so much for the wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be here and part of this proceeding today. It's really a phenomenal opportunity, so thank you for giving me this chance. It's my distinct pleasure to really introduce and moderate this panel of exemplary folks. You know, I've been reading their papers and I've just been blown away by the passion, I think first and foremost of what everyone's bringing to the table about this challenge, but also opportunity we have around fighting climate change, but also doing it in a just way. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we'll jump into the video. First, we have Dave Grossman. Dave is a principal at Greenlight Consulting, a consulting practice he founded in 2006 that provides research, writing, and strategic advice on projects involving a wide range of climate and energy policy issues, as well as other sustainability topics. We have Mahiyar Saror. She has a background in environmental justice, grassroots organizing, and working on issues related to air and water quality, clean energy policy, and zero waste. She is a proud Minnesotan and a proud Iranian American who is passionate about climate justice and keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Can't wait to hear more about that. Then we'll talk to Kayleen Hung. Kayleen is a chemical engineer with a background in energy efficient technologies and solar. In her day job, she's an energy and utilities consultant specializing in preparing utilities for a distributed energy future. You know, I love as we go through here, everyone has day jobs and night jobs and they're all solving these issues for us. It's pretty amazing that folks have put so much commitment day and night into the work we're doing. Next, we have Matt Lucas. Dr. Matt Lucas is a chemical engineer and entrepreneur with experience in venture capital and project finance. Again, in his day job, he supports innovators scaling up first-of-a-kind clean energy technologies, including clean transportation fuels. And finally, but not last but not least, Alice Grossman. Dr. Alice Grossman is an expert in transportation policy, planning and engineering with a focus on sustainability and performance management. Can you talk more about how the steady rising fee for GHG emissions would enable a just transition?
Sure, and I'm sure it'll be even better this time.
It will.
So basically there's two aspects to a carbon fee, and they both really matter in terms of equity and justice. You've got the fee part, putting a fee on the carbon emissions or all the greenhouse gases. And then you've got the revenue that's raised, which is used in important ways. So let's start with the fee. On the fee side, the fee sends an economic signal, and the paper that my co-authors and I put together calls for this fee to serve as a backstop. That's the enforcement mechanism part of the title, to make sure that US emission reductions stay on track. It's like an insurance policy. And staying on track for emission reductions and for achieving zero carbon by 2050, net zero by 2050 is important, because we can't assume that the zero carbon transition is inherently good for all communities. But at the same time, not transitioning quickly would be terrible from a justice and equity perspective, given the effects of climate change and air pollution. So that fee part is really important from an equity and justice perspective. Then you've got the revenue side, and that's important in a couple ways. So first, there's dividends. Dividends in our plan would be a progressive dividend, and it should more than offset the impact of the fee for most low and middle income households. So that's one part. And too often in carbon pricing, that's sort of where the equity discussion ends. Like, oh, we'll give some money and that'll make everyone whole and that's enough. But it's not. A core aspect of our paper is about the investments. And we've already heard from the folks on the first panel, we'll hear more on this panel, we'll hear more on the next panel about the importance of investments. And carbon pricing can be a source of investment dollars. So that can be investments in stuff that we've already heard about, things like building retrofits, making buildings healthier, which can lower the energy cost burden for communities. We've got investments in things like just transition for workers and communities that are transitioning away from highly emitting fuels and industries. So that's stuff like job training and financing for new businesses. We heard about that already. Things like investments in clean energy job training and technology deployment to help spread the benefits of the transition. But also investments in some things we haven't heard as much about. So investments in additional emission reductions. If you help accelerate the closure and the conversion of polluting facilities and emitting vehicles, that's the pollution that's burdening communities, and investments there can make a big difference. And then finally, investments in resilience make a huge difference. You can help protect these communities from the impacts of climate change, and these are often the most vulnerable communities to those impacts. So it's both the fee and the use of revenues that can advance both justice and equity in this transition.
I appreciate that.
And I have no idea if everyone heard me on that one or not.
I hope so, because it was really, really good, and we really appreciate, again, like I've asked in the beginning, I just want to go back to that. But first of all, this just transition enabled by a market signal essentially is something that I think is needs to be talked about more. Especially you start about basically it was just a feedback loop. Once you start doing the investments, it starts creating these other outcomes. So briefly, can you talk about why this is good for business as well?
Sure. This again goes back to both the economic signal and the investment. I mean, it's both sides of the carbon pricing approach. So the fee itself sends a signal economy-wide, and that is somewhat different from a lot of the sectoral approaches that are out there. And a carbon fee is not meant to supplant those; it's meant to complement those. So a carbon price sends the economy-wide signal. That signals to businesses and investors about the sorts of things to invest in to grow. Sorry, I'm seeing comments again about what people can and can't do. The carbon price sends an economic signal to investors about the businesses to invest in this transition. That can help grow businesses, that can help make clean energy business more competitive, businesses central to decarbonization in a range of ways. But then you also have the investment side again. And so you can invest in businesses that'll be part of this transition, grow those key sectors and create not just clean energy access, but ownership opportunities in these communities. It's an economic signal about where the transition is going, and that is good for business to be aligned with those signals.
Appreciate that, and I really enjoyed your paper, and look forward to seeing many of these ideas adopted. So thanks for the time today. We're going to flip to Mahiyar Saror. Mahiyar, we don't have the video up, so we're going to talk about your paper from the title, and then we're going to jump in. Your paper was Rejecting Line 3 to Support a Clean Energy Future. So just to help us get started here, what is Line 3?
Sure. So Enbridge's proposed Line 3 replacement pipeline project is a large tar sands pipeline that's being proposed up in greater Minnesota. It would come from the Alberta tar sands up in Alberta, Canada, and flow directly through greater Minnesota and end in Superior, Wisconsin. So it's a project that is currently moving in the state, just received its state clean water permit, and Army Corps just issued the 404 permit as well. So it is unfortunately moving forward in the state of Minnesota.
I appreciate the quick overview. So question about that then, I'm sure you're a proud Minnesotan, as you mentioned in your bio. So I'm sure the proponents of Line 3 are talking about this as an economic boon for Minnesota. So can you share your thoughts on actually how that may not be the case and how not moving forward with the project could provide a more sustainable economic impact?
Sure, I'd be happy to. You know, instead of building this pipeline project, we can and we must build back better through rebuilding our state and our country's crumbling infrastructure. We can invest in union jobs that pay a livable wage and build back our roads, our bridges, transit, rail, broadband to connect our communities, and so much more. We can also invest in jobs in the renewable energy sector. You know, renewable energy is growing faster in Minnesota than fossil fuels, producing jobs at a faster rate than any sector of the fossil fuel industry. And, you know, as President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris have already expressed support for the cleanup of orphaned oil and gas wells, there's also an opportunity for jobs in the removal of the existing Line 3 pipeline. You know, so the current Line 3 pipeline is over 50 years old. It has over 900 structural anomalies. So the current pipe is just leaking tar sands oil in the ground. And there's an opportunity there for workers to remove that existing Line 3, to decommission it, and then really think about how Minnesota can be a leader in clean energy, as it already is and as it continue to should be.
I appreciate that. You know, and it's not just economic, right? So can you help us learn more and hear about what the social justice implications of stopping the pipeline would be as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, even the Minnesota Department of Commerce estimated that the climate effects due to the Line 3 pipeline will result in $287 billion in social costs over 30 years. So that's the equivalent of building 50 coal-fired power plants. You know, if built, this pipeline would cross more than 200 bodies of water. It would flow through the pristine lake country of northern Minnesota, where Indigenous people harvest wild rice and hold treaty rights. All pipelines have a history of leaking, and Enbridge, who's the company that is responsible for this current proposed project, was responsible for one of the largest inland oil spills in US history. So what happens to Minnesota's clean drinking water when Line 3 inevitably leaks, impacting over 200 bodies of water that this pipeline would cross, and the over 20 million people who drink the water downstream from this proposed project? In addition to that, you know, in this moment when we are dealing with a COVID pandemic, we're seeing a surge in COVID cases all across the state. Having workers from out of state come in to construct this pipeline adds already to the overburden that communities in northern Minnesota are facing because of the pandemic. You know, a Biden-Harris administration can order an immediate pause on pipeline construction while they conduct a full federal environmental impact statement. You know, as we are hearing from the Biden-Harris administration on their commitments to environmental justice, on their commitments to tribal consultation, we need a cumulative impact and a full life cycle analysis of this proposed project in order to prevent a public health crisis and really the environmental injustices and serious threat that this pipeline would pose to Indigenous people, to environmental communities. And really, this project falls short of the progress that we need to achieve our climate goals.
Thanks for that. Right. I mean, $286 billion in potential impact, I think is what you said. That's not a small number. And the idea that we can not only stop this, but that we can build back better. Right. And I really appreciate also, you know, mentioning, you know, what the Biden-Harris administration can do about this. And so with that, actually, I think that's a great segue into our next panelist. So Kayleen Hung, I think, again, we don't have the video, but I think you have a bit of an announcement to make. So before I dive in even any deeper, do you want to make the announcement?
Yes, definitely. So in addition to rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement on day one, Biden has also committed to holding a Climate World Summit within his first 100 days in office. So our paper recommends 4 key announcements that the administration could make during this summit. Because we think the summit is an exceptional opportunity to show unhesitating commitment from the US to global climate leadership and to rebuild key bilateral relationships, international forums, and financial institutions. So if I could go over each of the 4 key announcements. I know they were mentioned in the video, so I'll just go over them really briefly. So first, we recommend that the administration start a coalition of countries to develop standardized guidelines to systematically align all global development cooperation with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The main purpose of this coalition would be to rally financial institutions and regional development banks to encourage lending practices in line with the net zero energy goals, and to immediately direct substantial investment towards green infrastructure and development. So this recommendation at its core is reasserting that the Biden administration is willing to aid in facilitating the economic transformation of developing countries in the face of climate change. Secondly, we recommend that the Biden administration hold a coalition or build a coalition to press major coal financing countries to put a moratorium on coal investments around the world and to redirect these funds to clean alternatives. This pillar is really showing that the administration is committed to developing a fair transition plan for coal communities with respect to job opportunities and training, with key precise timelines for one, discontinuing these investments and production, and then 2, steps for replacing planned coal plants with alternative energy sources, and 3, financial mechanisms to ensure that funds are available to facilitate this transition. Our third recommendation is for the administration to make an announcement about recognizing that the benefits of advancing gender equity include improved climate change mitigation and adaptation. For example, by improving women's access to education, reproductive health, and productive farming resources will significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and strengthen the resiliency of communities to adapt to climate change. The status of women and girls are crucial to meeting the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And again, we recommend that the administration emphasize this holistic approach to solving both climate change and gender equity during the summit. Lastly, our paper recommends elevating climate change as a core national security priority. And by doing so, we hope that it brings awareness to the need for increasing operational viability and resiliency of our defense programs. So we recommend that the Department of Defense to enlist the nation's veterans to rebuild our crumbling energy infrastructure and to carry out the DoD's energy efficiency and renewable energy initiatives and programs. So just to sum up the 4 key announcements, we not only want to reassert US leadership in climate policy, but also it shows that the Biden administration is committed to meeting these goals of the Paris Agreement while making sure that developing countries, coal workers, women and girls, and veterans are not left behind in the process.
I mean, absolutely phenomenal. You know, it's a breath of fresh air to hear about the types of policy announcements that can be made from a Biden-Harris administration to get us back, and like you said, to reassert the U.S.'s leadership in climate policy. So thank you so much for sharing the 4 pillars of the announcements that you're looking to be made. And I can't wait to see us get back to work in this critical space. So for our next panelist, question for Matt Lucas. So Matt, your paper was National Low Carbon Fuel Standards, Supply Side Clean Transportation Policy Beyond Electrify Everything. So question to you is first of all, because we don't have a video, can you talk a bit more about what a low carbon fuel standard looks like?
You bet. Thanks, Devin. So what we forget is that the leading source of emissions in the US is actually transportation. It's not the power sector. And over 40% of those emissions come from end uses. Think rail, marine, medium and heavy duty trucking, and of course, aviation, which are resistant to electrification. So as we think about achieving our decarbonization goals and with it reducing the criteria pollutants, those are the local air pollutants that lead to things like asthma, we need to keep in mind how we're going to address these sectors that we can't electrify. A low carbon fuel standard is a revenue neutral market-based trading system specifically targeted to transportation that allows you to address these sectors. The key thing here is we need to make sure we achieve these decarbonization goals regardless of the pace of electrification. So we don't know how we're going to get there necessarily today, and we don't know how that might change over time. So by being technology agnostic and avoiding technology lock-in, we're always going to be sorting for that cheapest solution. That's really important to meeting our affordability goals. And we know that this is possible both because we have multiple successful state programs, and we've seen that those state programs have gotten cheaper over time. We've also seen that they've demonstrated effective cost containment.
Appreciate that. So you mentioned there's this 40% of the hard to reach portion of the transportation sector. So how does the low carbon fuel standard, it's technology agnostic, but how do we get to that corner of the market? 40% is not a corner. That's a sizable portion. So what does a low carbon fuel standard do to make that happen?
Yeah, so the beauty of this is that we don't have to guess about what this future looks like. A low carbon fuel standard is a great example of cooperative federalism. We have multiple states that have implemented successful low carbon fuel standards within their own borders and jurisdictions. So we know how to do this. And what we found is that the process is seamless to consumers and ultimately very cheap. In California, which runs by far the largest low carbon fuel standard by fuel volume, the impact has been less than $0.10 a gallon at the pump to the end consumer. We need to understand that that is less than a fraction. It is only a fraction of the federal gas tax, and it's driving first of a kind technologies that aren't being deployed anywhere else. And that's how we're going to generate these sort of next gen solutions that can help address these needy areas, like how do we fly an airplane, on zero net carbon.
Thank you. Really appreciate that, and thank you for the examples of where we've already had some successes in the states. Like you said, looking for where we've already had success as we look to implement these policies, I think is very important, especially because we don't have much time. We got to get to work now. So really appreciate your insight and your perspectives in your paper. Moving to our last panelist, Dr. Alice Grossman. Your paper was Healthy, Low-Cost, Sustainable Transport for All, Active Mobility to Get America Moving. So I really liked it in your paper. You mentioned that we need to focus on moving people and not vehicles, which is, to me, one of the biggest, obviously it's a no-brainer, but obviously you're pointing out that's not what we look at right now. So can you talk a bit more just about the idea of what active mobility is targeting, or what active mobility is?
Sure. Thanks, Devin. When we say active mobility, we mean, for the most part, people walking, people on bicycles, people on scooters, any sort of non-motorized or very lowly motorized transportation. And so this is obviously, when you think about active transportation, you have all of the public health implications, first of all. But when we're thinking about it from a climate perspective, there's the reduction in emissions perspective, the land use perspectives. And I think, one of the things you just said, and that some of our other panelists have talked about, is we can't approach this from one side at all, right? Is we've got to do as much as we can as quickly as we can. So in the transportation sector, electrification is an answer. High standards for low emissions on vehicles is also another, important step we need to take. But also getting people out of their vehicles when we can has so many benefits for local economies, for public health, and for trying to reduce emissions, especially in neighborhoods where people are already, as somebody said earlier, low income and neighborhoods of color are already disproportionately suffering from poor air quality from transportation, and for public health outcomes associated with that. So we need to think about how we can get people walking and biking and doing it safely. Deaths for people walking and biking are increasing in the United States. Over 6,000 pedestrians died on our roads last year. And let me tell you, these are not pedestrian crashes where people are dying, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not only we have to think about how to get people walking and biking, but the whole other side of this equation also is there's a huge safety issue out on the road that also largely contributes to negative climate outcomes, and that's vehicles. And so how do we get to thinking about our transportation network instead of thinking about vehicles, which the only positive outcome those have is getting people from one place to another, and really thinking about that outcome. Is that the outcome we want? Okay, how do we move people? Moving people is the goal. And we need to reframe our policies and our funding structures and our entire thought process and planning and policy around that.
Appreciate that. And then, one follow-up question is, you talked about this idea of active mobility as saving lives, right? And as having mitigation effects against climate change. How does it affect jobs or economic activity? So you mentioned that in your paper. Yeah.
Sure. In terms of jobs, I'm not going to pretend like bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure is incredibly expensive and boosting the economy in that way. But it is true. There have been studies that show that pedestrian and cycling infrastructure can create up to 11 jobs per $1 million spent. So there are jobs there. But what I think is one of the actually strongest arguments here when we think about the economy and people walking and biking is that there are numerous studies that show that local businesses make more money off of people who walk and bike and are walking to and from transit. So if we think about it that way, we're stimulating the economy, not necessarily just from making sure we're building and maintaining sidewalks, but also just getting people out on the street is actually one of the main focuses that we should have here. And having people out on the street means that they're shopping at local businesses, and that's important for our own local economies everywhere. So.
I mean, that makes sense. You have people walking around and riding bikes. They're going to see that storefront,
coffee, right? You don't.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I can't roll by a storefront and see something I like and just keep going. So that does make sense. Really appreciate your thoughts. And again, this idea of moving people, not vehicles. It's almost profound that that's not the focus of transportation policy as it is. So thank you for pushing that. I think we have our video back up now. So although we've asked all of our questions, I'd like to have the opportunity to share that with everybody. So panelists, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to hear from you and your paper ideas, and look forward to working with you in the future.
I'm going to hand it over to Rose McKinney-James. Rose was also a CE4B Executive Council member, and she's the former CEO for the Corporation for Solar Technology and Renewable Resources. She's also a former commissioner with the Nevada Public Service Commission and served as Nevada's first director of the Department of Business and Industry. She is the managing principal of Energy Works LLC and McKinney James and Associates. Her firms provide business consulting services and advocacy in the areas of public affairs, clean energy policy, and economic and sustainable development. So with that, Rose, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce your panelists and tee up the video.
Really happy to be here. I think one of the best things about being a part of Clean Energy for Biden has been the chance to work with such a phenomenal group of advocates and experts from around the country, giving me a chance to learn a great deal from my perch here in Las Vegas. And I'm also really incredibly gratified to see discussions around equity really take hold and expand into every aspect of the clean energy conversation, from transportation electrification to community investment, public health, affordable housing, and also some issues outside of what we consider traditional areas. Many of them have risen to the top of the list for these policy positions that have been provided. And I think our panel will provide some exciting perspectives and from a really impressive array of experts in their respective fields. So let me just introduce the panel, and then we'll go to the video, and then we'll have a little Q&A. Let me begin, I think, with Jahi Wise, who is a clean energy and climate equity professional with over a decade of experience working in the intersection of climate policy, clean energy finance, and community economic development. Jahi has worked on clean energy finance and equitable investment at the local, state, and national level for a variety of public, private, and nonprofit organizations. Vicki Corman, who I've had the pleasure of working with, is a former official with the Obama administration. She was the Deputy General Counsel at EPA, served as a senior sustainability advisor to the administrator. Vicki has served in private practice, and she represents clean energy and environmental clients. She previously served as general counsel for the District of Columbia's Department of Energy and Environment, a trial attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice, staff attorney in New York for that EPA, and staff on the Senate EPW Hazardous Waste Subcommittee. So I want to welcome Vicki. Anna Lindsay. Anna is a climate justice advocate with nearly 15 years of experience shaping energy policy and deploying large-scale clean energy programs to empower marginalized communities. And this is a passion that stems from her lived experience as a Filipina immigrant. Julia Hostwit is a seasoned expert in the intersection of climate change, affordable housing, and community development, and is an emerging voice on social justice, human rights, and government reform. And during her decade at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, she proposed and directed special initiatives to improve the sustainability, health, and resilience of affordable housing nationwide. And then finally, Jonathan Klein, who is the co-founder of multiple thriving social ventures, including Go Public Schools, Revolution Foods, and the Oakland Public Education Fund. He's an experienced teacher and working with large urban school districts. He's advised parents, teachers, superintendents, school board members, principals, and education entrepreneurs across the country. So you can see we have a very diverse but really impressive panel. And so now I will turn to the technical folks to run those videos. Thanks.
President-elect Biden has committed to ensuring that frontline communities harmed by climate change and pollution are the first to benefit from climate investment. This paper outlines a number of steps the Biden-Harris administration can take to actualize these commitments. I will highlight 3. First, establish a mechanism for identifying frontline communities that incorporates the cumulative impacts of climate change, pollution, public health, and socioeconomics. Recent legislation such as the Climate Equity Act of 2020 offer good starting points. Second, enable a whole-of-government approach to frontline climate investment by creating a White House-level interagency working group that tracks federal frontline investments. This can be done through a new White House Council on Environmental and Climate Justice or through the existing Council on Environmental Quality. Third, invest in the implementation infrastructure necessary to turn investment into actual projects by capitalizing a national clean energy and sustainability accelerator and state and local green banks, as proposed by recent House and Senate bills. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Vicki Corman. This summer, my co-authors and I witnessed the grossly disproportionate impacts of COVID on frontline workers in vulnerable communities. We also witnessed the cleaner air and bluer skies that resulted from the reductions in vehicular traffic that occurred in response to COVID. We recommend measures such as the following as critical to reducing health risks while also unleashing economic opportunity, in particular in the communities bearing the brunt of the pandemic. First, rebooting programs such as Cash for Clunkers to reduce air pollution and facilitate the transition to clean electric vehicles. Second, providing incentives to close the gap in investment in the charging infrastructure needed to meet projected electric vehicle demand. Third, providing grants to accelerate transportation electrification in frontline and vulnerable communities, for example, by defraying the costs of replacing older buses, garbage trucks, and agricultural equipment. And finally, establishing an inclusive frontline and vulnerable communities clean transportation advisory committee. Thank you, and we look forward to the discussion.
My name is Anna Leasing. I've spent the past 15 years scaling Equitable Clean Energy Solutions. We're proposing a suite of policy solutions that would modify and build on existing federal regulations. Specifically, we recommend modifying HUD regulations to increase energy efficiency and renewable energy investments in public housing, modifying federal funding regulations to enable comprehensive energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, including community solar, modifying income verification requirements to facilitate community solar participation for low-income households, federal funding for climate resiliency projects in frontline communities, creating an on-bill financing model to incentivize utilities to finance clean energy projects in frontline communities, and lastly, creating an interagency task force to establish one-step enrollment of all income-qualified housing, food, and energy assistance programs. These are steps that the Biden administration can take almost immediately to improve health and quality of life in frontline communities.
The national affordable housing stock is unsustainable in terms of cash flow, environmental impact, human health, and disaster preparedness. The backlog of capital repairs and the federal outlay for utility costs and disaster recovery swells each year, Meanwhile, investments in green retrofits, renewable energy, healthy homes, and climate resilience provide some of the best returns on investment that are possible for the affordable housing stock. Billions of dollars that can be reinvested to preserve affordable housing and improve social services. Our paper makes specific recommendations for the federal government to use to create this positive spiral of cutting waste and reinvesting savings. Number 1, adopt contemporary data collection and analysis practices, which will empower policymakers and grantees to make better investment and management decisions. Number 2, remove structural barriers and align economic incentives to promote building and community improvement projects that are cost-effective, sustainable, resilient, equitable, and healthy. And number 3, adopt architectural and urban planning standards that are cost-effective over the long term.
Hello, Clean Energy for Biden. I'm Jonathan Klein. We've got lots of work to do. Where do we start? And how does government show up? Not just on the news or in Washington, but in the lives of American families. The answer is in our schools. Reopening America's schools safely is core to our economic recovery. Unfortunately, our schools are far behind after decades of underinvestment. Now is the moment to propel our school infrastructure into the clean energy future. Now is the moment to make the promise of the clean energy economy real for millions of Americans in red states and blue states, in cities and rural towns. To do so, we recommend passing the Reopening and Rebuilding America's Schools Act and standing up a WPA-style Sustainable Schools Corps. Here's what we'd get: 2 million well-paid clean energy jobs, healthier schools when and where we need them most, and students, teachers, and families and communities across the country as allies in shaping and realizing our clean energy future together. Thanks.
So those were fabulous videos. I'm so glad that the participants had a chance to hear that. I want to tee up a handful of questions for the panel. And Vicki, I want to start with you. Someone who has had an opportunity to be a part of an administration coming from the Obama administration. Transportation electrification has been at the top of the list of priorities for many of us in the climate space. And perhaps you can help us frame the conversation from the standpoint of what we're here to talk about, and that is sort of expanding and strengthening the role of equity as we begin to really think about our clean energy policies. So beyond the incredible impacts of COVID and issues around air quality, health being a significant issue, maybe you can help us understand how that really fits into vehicle electrification.
Thank you. And it's been a real privilege to work with you over the summer in the events that we participated in. Thank you. It's been great to meet you. I think that the single most issue is going to be the impact on health. And the impact on health has huge economic ramifications. But as we do know from COVID, as you said, that the impacts of air pollution, in particular from vehicles and fossil fuel burning vehicles, was disproportionate, grossly disproportionate to people of color, communities of color, and low-income communities. And in DC, where I'm from, 76% of the deaths from the pandemic were from Black residents in DC. Meanwhile, with the air pollution, during the stay-at-home, during the shutdown, the air pollution, the air quality dramatically increased. Between March 13th and April 16th, there were 2 code yellow, which means moderate air quality days in 2020. In the same period in 2019, there were 14 code yellow days. So we know in April, the Harvard School of Public Health came out with a study that said people with COVID-19 who live in areas with high levels of air pollution are more likely to die from the disease than people who live in less polluted areas. And that within those areas, the neighborhoods likely to be hit hardest are poor neighborhoods and communities of color. So the impact on health, but economic as well, is significant if we are reducing these emissions that have been so disproportionate in their impact. In mid-September, the American Lung Association estimated that transitioning to renewable powered transportation solutions by mid-century will save thousands of lives, avoid tens of thousands of asthma attacks, hundreds of thousands of other health impacts, such as days lost from work, tens of billions of dollars in health costs, and that doing this in 2020 would reduce climate threatening emissions by more than 1.4 billion metric tons. Doing this in 2020 would reduce 1.4 billion metric tons in 2050 compared to business as usual. The easy thing for, I think, us to grasp from the administration, from having been in the prior administration, is we know how to do this. We have the tools. We don't actually have to invent new tools, but we do need to invent new ways of implementing these tools. So as I think, as other speakers have said, first and foremost is going to be ensuring that representatives from the most impacted communities are going to be included in the formulation of the new programs or devising the ways in which we revive prior successes. So we ensure that equity is built into every single pilot, every funding stream, every program that is implemented. So for example, we can dust off something like the Cash for Clunkers program that was so successful at removing older, dirtier cars from the roadways and therefore improving air quality. But it also means that we could follow programs like California's Clean Cars for All and incentivize lower income drivers to replace older, high polluting cars with electric vehicles or electric bikes or other mobility options. Or similarly, to fine tune it to neighborhoods where we can make sure that we're increasing charging infrastructure. Some of the grants and incentives that can be provided, as others have been saying, need to be dedicated towards or targeting in on making opportunities for financing available in priority communities, but also making things like charging infrastructure available in priority communities. And all of this is going to create tremendous amounts of jobs. The Advanced Energy Economy reports that $1 billion in investment in non-residential electric vehicle charging infrastructure could support between 6,000 to 15,000 jobs a year. Building a national electric vehicle charging network could help more than 35,000 Americans who lost electric and electric hybrid vehicle related jobs get back to work. So the impacts are health, economic, jobs, but opportunity also for and targeting, ensuring equity in all of those decisions, which we know how to do. We can do this.
Which is good to know and underscore opportunity,
Yes.
all about execution. Well, thank you, Vicki. I want to, speaking of tools, I want now to turn to Jahi. Nothing happens without adequate resources. And I'd really appreciate it if you could, and certainly going back to your video, share a little bit more about your thoughts on which policy tool you'd recommend that the Biden-Harris administration implement on day one to accelerate equitable climate investment in these frontline communities that Vicki has identified.
Thanks, Rose. That's a really good question. It's great to be on this panel. So the paper I worked on with our co-authors lays out a number of different policy proposals for advancing equitable investment in frontline communities. I think I wanted to highlight one tool that I think is a pretty innovative mechanism for making sure that the $2 trillion commitment that President-elect Biden has made, 40% of which will flow into disadvantaged communities, that money actually creates real benefits in those communities. And that's the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, which is an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan entity, national climate finance entity that would be mandated with investing in communities across the country and making clean energy transactions happen. And there's a couple reasons why I think it's really important to think about the mechanisms as we look at the next administration. Climate investment first, public climate investment has to facilitate private climate investment. We know that there's not enough public dollars to do all the work that has to be done in all the communities all across our country and across the world that needs to be done to facilitate the climate transition. I think this tool is innovative in that for every public dollar that goes into a community, it leverages 3 private dollars. And this is based on the track record of 15 plus institutions across the country called green banks that have been doing this public to private leverage for years. And so I think this idea of creating a national entity to undertake this same leveraging effect specifically in frontline communities is really innovative in a way to scale up whatever size and public investment we make into almost triple or quadruple in private sector investment as well. I think it's second, and this was mentioned on one of the earlier panels, we really have to make sure at this time we build the infrastructure in frontline communities to take control and ownership of the clean energy transition. It is insufficient for us to create programs that helicopter in dollars and then leave after this administration without leaving the infrastructure for folks to originate their own projects, facilitate those projects, and sustain clean energy economies in these frontline communities. And again, I think green banking is particularly unique in being able to create this infrastructure. And so green banks are the frontline delivery mechanisms. They are on the ground. They are doing the small distributed energy resource projects. They are doing the larger utility scale projects that actually make the clean energy transition go. And so I think an institution that's purpose built to actually create more of these small institutions in frontline communities is really important to making sure that frontline investment really generates benefits for these communities. And then lastly, jobs, and everyone's touched on this. It's really important for us to think of how every proposal we create creates jobs and businesses. The benefit of the clean energy transition, in addition to saving our collective lives, is it's a collective economic boon for all of us. And so we've done some economic model. I've seen some economic modeling on the National Clean Energy Finance Accelerator, and $100 billion investment into that entity would create over 4.3 million jobs over the course of 4 years. That's a massive injection of local jobs in communities, and local contracting companies, and local solar development companies, and local banks that need to transfer that investment and turn into real projects. So I think this is a really interesting mechanism that we should think about implementing, and I think it's something that the Biden-Harris administration can do on day one. A version of this entity passed the House twice this past summer with $20 billion of funding. There's tremendous momentum behind it, and I think it's something that should seriously be considered for the first day.
Thank you for that. Embracing innovation, thinking about the infrastructure for sure, and then jobs, jobs, jobs. I get it. Thank you very much. Julia, I am transitioning to you, someone else who's had some experience with the administration, given your time with HUD. And the paper that your team worked on included many highly detailed recommendations for federal agencies, especially HUD. And given the new administration's desire to hit the ground running, as well as the possibility that the Senate remains in Republican control, though we're not buying into that. We have work to do. Which actions should this new administration prioritize in the first 100 days?
So we're strongly recommending that the new administration commit from day one to transformative change by starting right away on changes that are truly fundamental, common sense, and long overdue, so that we don't find ourselves still fighting to overcome the same structural problems 30 or 50 years from now. So I'm going to give you some added detail about a few game-changing actions from our paper, which focuses on high return on investment, multi-impact interventions into the national affordable housing stock. The first one is utility benchmarking and benchmarked utility funding. I'll start with a little bit of oversimplified background for the sake of clarity. The federal government effectively gives a blank check to most affordable housing providers and tenants to cover their utility bills. HUD doesn't really know, not in a very accurate way, what its grantees are spending or what they should be spending, and neither do the housing providers or the tenants themselves. There's also no economic incentive for housing providers to build or operate efficiently. And even if a housing provider is motivated to make improvements, they can't keep the savings, which means that they can't repay the upfront money that it took to make the improvements in the first place, and they can't attract a loan. So the solution to this problem is to institute utility benchmarking practices and then to benchmark utility funding for housing providers and tenants. That's how you provide funding that's right-sized, equitably distributed, predictable, and that empowers housing providers to build and operate efficiently. HUD has an existing strategic plan to institute utility benchmarking practices, and it includes developing contemporary accounting software for housing providers with a slew of business intelligence tools built in, and providing extensive learning and capacity support. But the Trump administration shelved the work, and it really should be restarted on day one. The second thing I want to talk about is third-party financing for green retrofits and renewable energy. Now, he just talked about this, and I just want to reiterate what he talked about because it's so important. Once you straighten out the HUD funding formulas, you're still left with the fact that most affordable housing providers aren't large enough to attract third-party financing. Since the private sector won't do it, the government really needs to step in and either seed a revolving loan program or, better yet, launch a national green bank like Jahi was talking about. And that'll provide the financial products that are needed for medium and small housing providers, as well as local governments, schools, and perhaps even homeowners directly. The third thing I want to talk about, this is kind of shifting modes a little bit to resilience, is the topic of FEMA flood maps and being able to map the vulnerability of the housing stock nationwide. If we're committed to protecting and empowering marginalized communities and communities of color, including but not limited to those that are in the affordable housing stock, we have to start today to understand where our vulnerabilities lie and to make urban planning, architecture, and investment decisions that'll address those vulnerabilities. And for those people who only care about cutting government waste, the exact same thing is what we should be doing. One thing that's critically necessary for all of that to happen is for FEMA to provide us with future-oriented flood maps. Delaying that process doesn't prevent the realities of climate change, it just prevents us from being able to prepare for it. And the last thing I want to talk about is abating lead from the country through a circular economy in the federal budget. 50 years after the US began banning lead, it's still a public health disaster, especially in communities of color. To top it off, the existence of lead paint in homes can also be a barrier to weatherization. So we need to immediately remove all lead hazards from homes, schools, and water pipes across the country once and for all. Luckily, the return on investment to government is from lead abatement projects is really enormous, which means that the Biden administration has an opportunity to do something innovative here and demonstrate the principles of a circular economy within the federal budget. If we empower the executive branch to do so, we can quantify the savings to, from one example, Medicaid, and then directly cycle those savings back across silos to fund lead abatement projects on and on until we actually finally rid lead paint from our country. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. A lot of food for thought. The words that I'm left with are transformative. I am so anxious to see us actually embrace the recommendations that you have outlined. I am struck by the fact that we're still tackling lead. Struck by it. Jonathan, I want to invite you. You have such a unique perspective. And certainly we're moving into an area that's garnered a ton of attention in recent months, but for a different reason, through the COVID lens, not necessarily a climate issue. But what I would love to hear from you is, why should the Biden-Harris administration and all of the clean energy leaders that are joining us here today focus in on the K-12 sector?
Yeah, thanks. I'm really humbled and inspired to be here. Thanks for moderating, Rose. And I as a new person to this space, radicalized at last fall's climate strike, chaperoning middle schoolers. I'm just really inspired and grateful for all the leadership and expertise tonight. So why focus on K-12? 3 reasons: impact within reach, transformation, and equity. First, on impact. The K-12 sector is bigger than you think. We have the largest fleet of public transportation with nearly 500,000 largely diesel buses. We spend $8 billion a year on utilities for 7.5 billion square feet of buildings with emissions that equate to 18 coal-fired power plants. And the within reach part of impact within reach is to make the point that this is our public sector. This isn't like the private sector where we have to cajole action with building codes and financial incentives. We can just decide to get our own public house in order in every level of government, and schools need to be a part of that. So second is transformation. Schools are a powerful place to build back better because of their transformative power. Schools are the place where we set young minds on a clean energy course. Every year, our high schools graduate over 3 million young people into the workforce. We've got to start yesterday with the next generation so that we have climate ambitious future leaders in every sector and from all backgrounds. And lastly, equity. After years of injustice, our frontline communities deserve disproportionate investment to mitigate the impacts of climate change, as others have said, and to prepare for careers in the clean energy economy. I think Jahi just said that previously. I think Lori Wygon-Jackson spoke to this on the first panel. And then students, disproportionately young people of color, miss approximately 14 million school days per year due to asthma caused by polluted air. And as COVID, I think you just mentioned this tonight, Rose, has reminded us, schools continue to be a vital source of nutrition for so many children and families. Schools play an absolutely vital role in community resilience. Communities don't function without schools. So I'm here as an education leader to say, we need each other. In the ed sector, we need the clean energy technology, the deployment experience, the financing, the clean energy policy making and regulatory advances. And y'all need our community, our kids, our teachers. We can help you build a new future. We can help you change the path that we are on by showing our kids a different way. And so my challenge to everyone is to think about how your company, your policy making, your advocacy and your skills can make a difference in our schools. And please reach out. We're building coalitions of leaders in education who are ready to engage with you.
Really powerful, very powerful, Jonathan. I think join all of our Clean Energy for Biden folks in acknowledging and recognizing that part of what we've been able to do is to unlock some additional opportunity for partnerships and collaboration. And thank you for being here. We're delighted to have you. So now we're going to move to you, Anna. I was so inspired by the way you introduced yourself to this conversation. It's clear that you have been working on the ground, as we say, in the trenches for a long period of time, and you come to it with a very personal passion. Your paper, though, took a look at what happens if we are not able to do what we're hoping to do. We need to look at what is already in place. So, you know, there's been an unprecedented focus on clean energy and now racial equality and equity broadly. But why do you think we should begin with the new administration by tweaking existing programs? Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about why that's your focus instead of entirely new programs. Give us a flavor for the cadence that you think we need to focus on.
Yeah, happy to. And thank you so much, Rose, for moderating. It's an honor to be here with such an esteemed group of people. So let's be clear, we do need transformative programs and systems that effectively serve frontline communities. Clearly, our current systems aren't doing that. And I think that needs to happen in addition to the recommendations that my co-authors and I made. We still don't know which party will control Congress, so we decided to focus on executive actions that the Biden-Harris administration could take immediately. So we start by reducing red tape. Currently, funding silos clean energy projects, which makes zero sense. It's much easier and cheaper to tack on solar and storage when you're already making energy efficiency upgrades. And on the flip side, it doesn't make sense to install renewables when you have gaping holes in your walls. These are just common sense changes to enable comprehensive clean energy projects in public housing, including making any necessary structural repairs. I can't tell you how many projects I tried to run where we finally got all the financing, vendors, everyone in place to find out, you know, the project was kiboshed because we had to have roof repairs and no one would fund that piece. So we, really looking at how we can improve these programs to make them actually effective and serve frontline communities. And we'd also reduce inefficiencies by creating program models for community solar and on-bill financing for states to adopt. But those are all from the administrator standpoint, right? We need to start centering the experience of the people we're serving. Right now, we subject folks through incredibly confusing and frustrating processes that strip them of their dignity. That's why we strongly recommend creating a one-step application and enrollment process for assistance programs. And just because I know we are well over time for this webinar, I want to leave folks with one thing tonight, and that is there is no silver bullet to achieving equity, just like there's no one solution that will get us to zero carbon. Equity and justice are things we have to tackle methodically and persistently in literally everything we do. We can't do that without BIPOC in leadership positions throughout this administration. We have to have BIPOC policymakers shaping our clean energy and climate justice strategies, have BIPOC agency officials making funding decisions, fund BIPOC entrepreneurs. Bottom line, empower people of color to create solutions.
I have nothing left to say. I think, Anna, you've said it all. Thank you, panel. You have been outstanding. Thanks for your patience. Nicole, back to you.
Thanks so much, Rose, and thank you, panelists, and thank you to all of our speakers. I want to say thanks to all the participants who stuck it out until the very end. Please stay engaged with CE4B. We're still visioning our future, and we'll continue in some form or fashion as we work to get Georgia blue and get to the inauguration. So with that said, I just want to send another big thanks. And next week on November 30th will be our last policy summit on innovation. And we'd love to see you next week. So thanks again, everyone, and good night.